Welcome to Local Everywhere. I'm Cynthia Pooler. My guest today is Simon Brooks, and Simon is a storyteller,
I
which
am.
I find fascinating. So, Simon, tell us a little bit about storytelling. How'd you get into it? What
Well,
interests you about storytelling?
so let's define storytelling in this particular context, because so many people use that word. Storytelling is thrown about left, right, and center. Taylor Swift, talks about storytelling, and it's kind of like, well, she's a singer-songwriter. We don't. She does tell stories, right? But that's not really what a storyteller is. Directors of movies, they call themselves storytellers, and it's like, well, you're directing, you're not telling a story, really. And writers call themselves storytellers, and to a certain degree, they are storytellers, but they're writers. The way that I feel about storytelling is an oral storyteller, the traditional storyteller. So I go around telling folk and fairy tales, myths and legends, and all that sort of stuff. And there are a couple of personal narratives that I throw in there every once in a while, but
Mhm.
mostly it's folk and fairy tales. So to get back to your original question of how I got into it, my mother jokes that I started telling stories coming out of the womb, and I used to write a lot of stories even as a young kid. And as I grew older, I would reread them. I was like, "That's rubbish," and I'd throw it in the trash can. To cut a very long story very short, I ended up working in a youth hostel, and the stories that I wrote as a young adult, I was trying out on these kids that would come and stay at the hostel. And then a school group took me to see a professional storyteller in Battle, which is where the Battle of Hastings took place. So it's just outside of Hastings on the south coast of England. And when I heard this storyteller, Eric Madden, I realized that those stories that he was telling, a lot of historical stories, were actually way better than anything else I was writing. And so I started telling folk and fairy tales and myths and legends and historical stories to the school groups and to the kids that would come to the youth hostel. And that's basically how I started it. And when I came over to the States a few years later, I didn't get the chance to tell stories to the public at that particular point, but I still told them to my wife's family. She has a lot of nephews and nieces who were young at the time, and so I would tell them folk and fairy stories. And then when we had our first, sorry about that, when we had our first child, I became a stay-at-home dad, and eventually someone suggested that I became a children's librarian, which I'm not trained in at all. But they said that a lot of the things that I do with my kid and other kids who I was hanging out with was kind of like children's librarian stuff anyway. And so I ended up doing that, and I would tell stories at the library, and the mommy circuit would take my name to other libraries that they were visiting, and those libraries started phoning me up and saying, "I hear you're a storyteller." And so it just grew organically, and now I travel all over the states telling folk and fairy stories to anyone who wants to listen.
So, when you say travel all over the states, how far do you go and where have you been?
So the furthest I've been so far is Los Angeles, California.
Mm.
And that was for a conference for matrimonial lawyers. And I got to stay at the Wilshire, and there was a weekend event that they were having there, and I got to tell folk and fairy tales that were related to family issues, and it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. But I've also been to Florida, I've been to Tennessee, I've been to Nebraska, yeah, and Alabama, yeah. So as well as New England, I've been all through the New England states.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Now, when you say folk and fairy tales, can you
Uh-huh.
define that?
Yeah, so Cinderella, although I don't tell that one, ironically, but a lot of people know that. Snow White, I also don't tell that one. Rapunzel, which I do tell. There's Stone Soup is another folk story that I tell, which is really good. There's a wonderful story from the east coast of England, which is called The Dead Moon, which is another favorite of mine. I tell stories. I tell a couple of Anansi stories, which of course come from Ghana originally. I love Anansi the spider. He is such a trickster. And actually, there's some very adult Anansi stories. So a lot of these folk and fairy stories, like the Dead Moon, I wouldn't necessarily tell that to little kids because it's not appropriate for them. There are some stories, Rapunzel, right? Rapunzel's a story about teen pregnancy and putting a woman up on a pedestal and trying to protect from the evils of the world, so I wouldn't tell that, and it's a long story as well, but I wouldn't tell that to little kids. But I tell that to upper middle school and high school and colleges and festivals and stuff like that where I go. So yeah, those kinds of stories.
So do you write your own stories?
Yes, I do that. So the folk and fairy tales I mean, all of these books behind me, these are all folk and fairy tale books, right?
Yeah.
And so I hear them from other storytellers sometimes. I read them, I get them from the books that I have, and I'll try and find as many variants of that same story as possible. And then what I do is I'll write my own version of it. There are some versions of stories which you might find in a collection, like picture books for younger people. And sometimes, when you've read as many stories that I have that have been collected and translated from all sorts of different languages, you get an idea of whether the story is a genuine story that's been collected authentically, or if it's been anglicized, or it's given a different lens. So there's a story from Japan which I absolutely love and have loved for a very long time, but I couldn't find what I felt was closer to the original version. The version I read was in a European picture book, and I felt that it had a very European lens to it and not a Japanese lens through which it was told. And so I ended up finding a Japanese storyteller friend of mine, and asking her if she could, do some research and see if she could find a genuine version of the story, which she did. She found a couple of them, and then somebody else, because I put a call out because I really wanted to tell this story, and there are a couple of other versions I came across, and I started to tell that story. And she gave me some, my friend Motoko, she gave me some really good insight into that story. Motoko is a really good storyteller, and she tells a lot of traditional Japanese stories. So
So
yeah.
there's a network of storytellers. Do
Oh
you
yeah.
have an idea? Do you have an idea? So you say, "Oh, I think I'll call up so and so and ask for their advice." Is that how it works?
Sometimes I do, yeah. I mean, it's usually when it comes to cultural stories that aren't my culture, and I'm having a problem with something, I'll phone up a colleague or a friend of mine who's from that culture and ask them what they think. So when I was in the UK, I was very much in love with first American stories, and so some of the first stories I told were first American stories. And then when I came over to the States, I heard that many of the first Americans don't like their stories being told outside of their own culture. And so I wanted to respect that. And so I stopped telling those stories. There are a couple of stories I do tell, but I have permission from first Americans to tell that story. But otherwise, I don't tell those. It's just those. There's just two stories that I tell from the Abenaki, one from the Abenaki culture and one from the Seneca culture, and I've got permission from people from those peoples to tell those stories. So that those kinds of things I get in touch with people about. Yeah, but we also, it's also fun to bounce ideas. So I'm in a cohort of eight. There's eight of us, and one of the folks is from Brazil. One of the people is African American. Then there's me, who's British, and the rest are American. One of them has Norwegian ancestry. One of them has Finnish ancestry. And we all work together and we'll share stories with each other. We'll practice our stories on each other. And sometimes, you get really good feedback. He says, well, I don't understand that part of the story. And so I have to realize that, okay, if they don't understand it, there might be other people that don't understand it. So how can I make people get what I'm trying to say with that story? Even if it's something like Cinderella, which I don't tell.
Now, how big is the network of storytellers in America?
It's fairly large. It's fairly large. It's what's really funny about it is that those people that know about storytelling, they'll be like, oh, so and so is a famous storyteller, but really we're no more famous than the best plumber in your town. If you know what I mean. We're not very well known because people don't really know what oral storytelling is. They've heard about it on The Moth, right? And a lot of people listen to that kind of stuff, but people haven't been to, some of these incredible festivals where there's a huge variety of storytellers doing all sorts of stuff. Like there's the National Storytelling Festival in Jonesboro, Tennessee, and there's another huge one which is called the Timpanogos Storytelling Festival, which is in Leahy, Utah, which is an incredible festival. And there's, I've been to the Florida Storytelling Festival here on the East Coast, and that's small and very local, but it gets a really good turnout. And it's the same as the one that I went to in Alabama. That's in Athens. It was kind of fun because I was like, oh, I'm going to Athens, and everyone's like, really, to tell stories? And I was like, Athens, Alabama. But it's another wonderful small storytelling festival, and there's lots of them all over the country, and some of them focus more on personal narrative and tall tales. Tall tales are stories that are made up. That you think that they're real stories, but they get stranger and stranger and stranger as the storyteller tells them, and then you realize, I think I'm being had here. Like a Shaggy Dog story kind of thing. So there are some festivals that focus on that, and then there are most of the storytelling festivals, I say, have a mixture of everything: folk and fairy tales, myths, legends, personal narrative, tall tales, and some of them they also have music, original folk music and new folk music. So they're a lot of fun to go to. I highly recommend your viewers and listeners to check some of them out and try them out.
Now, you live in New England and I live in New York. Are there any around here?
Yeah, there are guilds in most states. I'm trying to think. I don't know the names of them, but if you go to the National Storytelling Network, they have a list of guilds and they have a list of storytellers. I know that there's a guild in Albany, New York, which isn't too far. Which is where you are, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
There's a guild in and around Albany. There's another guild which is further down, which is where Washington Irving wrote
Okay,
his stories. There's a few storytellers around there,
okay.
and there's a number of guilds in New Hampshire. There's a very strong number of storytellers in the Boston area. And there's also a group of really good storytellers out in Western Massachusetts. And again, it's the same can be said for Rhode Island. There's also the Rhode Island Black Storytellers, which is a group of an organization of African American storytellers, which is really strong in Rhode Island. And Connecticut's the same. They have their own organization as well.
Now, I like to watch America's Got Talent,
hmm
and I have never seen a storyteller on America's Got Talent. Am I mistaken?
I don't think you. So there are people that use storytelling. So I was told, I think it was last year, someone said a storyteller won America's Got Talent, and I went to look because I don't often watch that show. I went to find out who it was, and it was actually a magician who told stories through his performance, right? And it kind of, and this is why I said at the beginning to define storytelling. It's like there are people that use storytelling, like the director uses storytelling, a writer uses storytelling, and to some degree they're storytellers, but they're not traditional storytellers, right? And you know, things like America's Got Talent. To start off with, you have to tell a story or you have to do a performance in 90 seconds, right?
Correct.
And that's a minute and a half. And yes, you could tell a story in a minute and a half, but it would be very much the bare bones of a story, or it would be an anecdote, right? And as you go further into the show, you get a little bit more than a minute and a half, 90 seconds, right? But you don't, you know, even a 5 minute story is really short. I mean, most of the stories I tell are 10, 20 minute long stories. And there's a handful of stories that I tell which are 40-minute stories. You know, and I tell these stories to kids, and a kid will sit down and listen to a 40-minute story. And a lot of the performances that I do, you know, they last an hour long. And they're, you know, if you've got the right group of kids, you know, I've gone like an hour and 10 minutes, and people are amazed because they don't realize that the stories have this real power. And you're not holding up a book and reading it. You're engaging with the, you know, you're looking at the audience as you're telling the story, and you engage the audience, and it becomes a very personal experience. And it really does create a community in that moment where you're telling the stories, which is incredibly powerful, you know, because you can bring people together. You know, I don't think there's a storyteller that I know who hasn't had someone come up to them afterwards and say, you really touched me, or, you know, I was having this issue with something, and this particular story helped me understand it in a new light, right? And these, you know, people like say, folk and fairy tales, you know, it's kid stuff. And it's really not, because it's quite often adults that will come to you and say that. You know, I mean, you'll also get some adults that, you know, come up to you and say, oh my gosh, that took me back to my childhood. And, you know, that was a really special experience for me, because it does that, you know. So, you know, I think there's a lot to be said for what we do.
So when did you decide to become a professional storyteller?
I would have to say, like most storytellers, it chooses you.
Okay.
So, like I said, you know, I was, you know, when I was doing when I was storytelling in England on the South Coast, I started doing that because I could see that parents who were showing up with their kids and they're on vacation for a week long, parents aren't used to having their kids with them 24/7, or most parents aren't, right? And most teachers aren't used to having the kids that they teach with them 24/7. And when a group comes away for a weekend or a week and they're all hanging out together and doing things together, you can see that people get a little bit frayed at the edges. And so I started telling stories to the kids to practice my stories, right? And I saw that there was a benefit, you know, that the kids seemed to enjoy it, right? And then when I started telling in the libraries, it was the mommy circuit that took my name to other libraries and said, oh, there's a storyteller here, right? I would never have told you, you know, 40 years ago that I was going to be a professional storyteller. I mean, it never occurred to me. You know, I thought I was going to be a rock star at one point. You know, I played the drums, I was in a few bands, and that was really what I wanted to do. I ended up studying photography, and that was my career for a long time. But yeah, I mean, storytelling now, it's just, I can't, you know, I'll talk to people that are just sitting around looking bored in airports and stuff, and I'll go and, you know, hey, you know, I'm a professional storyteller. Can I tell your kids some stories? They look bored, you know, and it's, you know, it doesn't happen very often because some people are like, no, we're good. They look at you kind of weird. But sometimes some people say, yeah, you know, and you get to tell the kids a little story, and it's fun. You know, I love it. It's brilliant.
So do you get do libraries, who contacts you to be part, you know, of their festivities and for you to tell stories?
So it started off with a library circuit. You know, I got on the library circuit, and that's a large majority of my work. I also do work for parks and recreation departments for their summer camps. There are some camps which hire me on a fairly regular basis. So I'll go and do, you know, private summer camps. They'll hire me, and I'll go and do storytelling there. Schools are another good place to go. So I get in touch with schools. I tell Gilgamesh, which is a Sumerian epic from a very long time ago. And some schools study ancient civilizations. And a lot of schools usually go with the Greek, but some schools try to do something other than the Greek because that's the normal. And so they'll do stories from India, you know, like the Ramayana, which is an incredible Indian epic, which I also have told to middle schoolers. And, you know, I'll go in and I'll do residences at schools and teach the kids stories. Some of them are personal narrative stories. Sometimes I'll tell folk and fairy tales. And then we do a presentation at the end of the week, and that's fun to do. And then conferences. I don't do too many conferences that are outside of the storytelling network because people don't understand it quite so well. But I did do some workshops with Timberland, the clothing company, and told some stories there. They had a retreat and they got in touch with me, and that happened. That was fun. Some of the educational conferences have hired me. And like I said, the matrimonial lawyers, they hired me to do presentations out in Los Angeles. And then you have all the festivals that are across the country, the storytelling and some of the folk festivals that they actually reach out to me now and get in touch. And I've also written to them and said, hey, hire me, you know, because you got to do that. It's all part of the work, you know. You got to go
Right.
bang on people's doors because otherwise you're a starving artist.
Right. So you mentioned Rapunzel.
Yes.
As a kid, I remember Rapunzel with the long hair, and she would uh, get her hair down the tower, and people,
Right.
you know,
Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair so I can climb the
right,
golden stair. Yeah,
right.
right.
Can you tell us a little story? How about Rapunzel? Can
Well,
you do that?
that's a long story. I mean, I
Uh,
could,
how
but I'm not
long
sure.
of it? How
It's
long of
about
it?
20 minutes.
Oh, okay. Can you do
Um,
one like maybe 5 or 10 minutes?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
There's yeah, hang on. I was looking around for my list of stories. Hang on, let me think for a second. So this is a grown-up story, and it's a story from India, and it's incredibly powerful. And it's about this woman, and she has 4 children. There are 2 boys and 2 girls, and she's on her own. This happened a long, long time ago, in a place far, far away, and she is not rich at all. She works as hard as she can to make as much money as she can, but it never seems to be enough to keep the house warm in the winter. It's never quite enough that she can feed her kids full meals. It's never quite enough that she can put new clothes on the children. And the children complain because the clothes are worn before they even get them. They're not new clothes, they're worn clothes, but they're not as worn as the ones that they used to have. And they complain and complain and complain. And as they complain, her hands, they start to get larger and larger and larger until she finds it hard to mend the kids' clothes. And when she goes to school to talk with the teachers about her children, she sees the teachers talk about her behind her back. She sees other parents walking past her and giving her the stink eye. And as she walks past these people, her feet grow larger and larger and larger. And then when she goes out into town, she also sees people that they turn away from her as if she smells badly, but she doesn't. She washes, she keeps herself clean. But her clothes are old and worn. And they see that they're not as clean as they could be because they are worn. And she sees people talking about her behind her back. Sometimes they actually say things in front of her face. And she wants to speak back to them, but her tongue starts to get larger and larger until she can't speak. And when her children see her with her hands that are so huge and her feet like so big and her mumbling under her breath because she can't talk properly because of her tongue, the children complain even more, and the weight of the world gets heavier and heavier upon her shoulders until she can't stand up anymore because the weight becomes a hump upon her back. And one day she's had so much, she's just had too much, she can't stand any more. And so she walks out of her home. She can barely undo the door. She trips over her feet as she leaves. And the hunch on her back is so heavy, it pushes her so far down that she can barely look up to see the direction in which she walks. But she walks and she walks and she walks until she comes to this house, or a once house. A house whose roof has collapsed in. A house whose windows are broken and shattered. A house that has one door missing and the other door falling broken off of its hinges. But she walks into that house. She just wants to be alone, unseen by anybody. And she sits down on the rubble in the center of that house and looks about her, and she sees that there are just the 4 walls. There is nothing else left of the house. Well, she looks at that south wall. She stares at it. She sees that there is paper on it and the paper's starting to peel down. And she starts to mumble and complain about her children who won't go out and get wood for the fire, her children who won't help her fix the clothes. And as she says these words about her children, who she does love dearly, the wall starts to crumble, the plaster comes off it, and the wall collapses under the weight of her woes. And she stares at this. But she doesn't want to look at the outside world, so she turns herself and faces the west wall. And she starts to complain about the teachers that put her down, the other parents that said things behind her back, or even to her face. And as she says these things, she realizes that her hands have shrunk back to their normal size. And she watches as she talks about these people and complains about them. And she sees that wall, a fissure cracks through it. The window falls out backwards and the wall tumbles down. And again, crushed by the weight of her woes. So she turns around and faces the west wall, the north wall, and she sees that her feet now have become their regular size. And she starts to complain about the people that she passes in the streets. She throws out her words, and the words get stronger and stronger and stronger, for her tongue goes back to its normal size, and she screams, and the window blows out, and the wall is pushed out into the world. And then she turns and faces the east wall. She talks about those she passes in the street, and she talks about her children, complaining about her figure, how she looks, her mouth, her hands. And as she talks to that wall and screams louder and louder at it, she finds herself once more being able to sit up straight, and that 4th wall explodes outwards. The woman, she stands up and she dusts herself down and steps out of those walls and returns home a stronger woman. The end.
That was wonderful. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you ever do, there's restaurants and bars and stuff that have
Yes, I do actually.
Do you ever do storytelling at those kinds of establishments?
Yeah. There was one that used to do storytelling in Centre Sandwich, and that was a lot of fun. And they would have, I think it was during the winter mostly, in the fall and through to the spring, they would do storytelling there. And they would do it, was it once a week, I think they would do it. And there would be an opening gala, and then every week they would have different storytellers. And the gala would be a number of different storytellers, some of whom would appear and do their solo shows. And they used to do that. They did that for years. And I used to be part of that every once in a while, which is a lot of fun. I've done it at a couple of bed and breakfasts. Once or twice I've done that. And there's a pub down in Nashua, New Hampshire, and they have me on a somewhat regular basis. 2 or 3 times a year, I'll go down and I'll tell stories for special events, like Valentine's Day, St. Patrick's Day. We did that back in March, and that was a lot of fun. Yeah, so yes, pubs. And actually there's a storyteller called Odds Bodkin who doesn't live too far away from me. He is an incredible storyteller. He uses a harp and he has a 12-string guitar, and he does a couple of pubs in the area, and he'll do like a 3-night session telling the Odyssey or the story of Hercules. It's quite incredible. So there are, not just myself, but there are other storytellers out there that do that sort of stuff. Yeah.
So if somebody wants to contact you,
Yes.
hire you, how would they do so?
Well, the easiest way to get in touch with me is to type in your browser simonbrooksstoryteller.com. That will redirect to diamondscree.com, but it's all legit.
Okay.
I had a blog which I used to use for my family, and then I started to get my photography career going back again, and I used my Diamond Scree, which is my blog website. And at the same time, the photography was taking off, the storytelling was taking off, and the storytelling just got, I was getting busier and busier with the storytelling. So I kind of put the photography aside. So that's why it's a strange website name. It wasn't designed to be that, but that is my website. But Simon Brooks Storyteller. There's no E in Brooks. It's just BROOKS. SimonBrooksStoryteller.com, and that'll get you to me. Yeah.
Great, Simon. This has been absolutely fascinating.
Well,
Thank
thanks, Cynthia. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So you've been listening to Simon Brooks. I'm Cynthia Pooler. This is Local Everywhere. And if you like this show, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a great day.
Thank you for having me. Bye.